Hello and welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. This is season 2, episode 4 of the show, and we're very excited to have our second very special guest of this season. Today we have on Dr. Sam Buckner, which we'll kick it over to him in a second to introduce him. I can intro this a couple ways, to be honest. On one hand, I could point out that there might be some different perspectives that we're kind of bringing onto the show compared to our previous guest, Dr. Eric Helms. I think naturally myself, Zach, Dr. Helms probably have a pretty similar viewpoint on the volume dose response relationship, which will be which is going to be the focus of today's show as well. Of course, there's some differences naturally as well. So that's one way to begin this show, is to point out the potential differences. But on the other hand, I don't really think there are all that many differences. We've spoken to Dr. Buckner in the past, and I think we hold a lot of similar values when it comes to science in general. And there's going to be, just in general, there's an overwhelming number of things that we probably agree on, maybe some slightly different perspectives here and there. And ultimately, more conversations are better. The data itself, analyses themselves are a starting point, but I think having conversations about that is very fruitful as well. And that's something that Dr. Buckner, you and your group and previous labs that you've been in, I've always appreciated the type of questions that you guys ask in your work, whether it is just questioning the basic assumptions of whether additional hypertrophy can lead to additional strength gains, right? Or I think there was a recent one related to volume load progression and whether that is something that I can't remember the exact topic of that one, but Sam, you might have to help me out with that one. But ultimately, as I'm distracted by a phone call that I just got, we appreciate your perspective, and you obviously have a particular interest in the volume dose response relationship. So with that, Sam, I'll kick it over to you and let you briefly introduce yourself. And in particular, it might be helpful to kind of lead that up to your work on the volume dose response relationship, because you had a paper in 2023 titled "The Dose Response Relationship Between Resistance Training Volume and Muscle Hypertrophy. There Are Still Doubts." So we're curious your general approach to this body of literature, a little bit about where you're at right now, what work you're doing, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, thank y'all for having me on. And I, to address the first part, I think the best conversations are with people you disagree with. And not that I think we disagree a whole lot, but even just different perspectives. Because like sometimes you learn something you didn't expect to learn, even if it's just that perspective and why someone thinks slightly differently. So that's something I value actually in the students I work with, and my mentor valued it. He was he wanted us to disagree with him, and sometimes he'd curse us out when we disagreed, tell us we're stupid in a kind way. But um, I value that so much, and I think these conversations are honestly my favorite to have. Um, so I guess a little background about me. I am the director of the USF Muscle Lab at University of South Florida. Here in Tampa. I've been here. I think I'm on my seventh year. And my lab focuses on examining skeletal muscle adaptations to various training interventions. And over the past few years, I suppose our interest has shifted a little bit. I'm interested in volume. I'm interested in the relationship between volume and muscle growth. And then I've also become a lot more interested in just measuring growth, understanding growth, quantifying growth. And I think it's a huge limiting factor for a lot of individuals that try to consume research, is that inability to read a paper and know if a finding is reasonable, know if a finding is in line with other findings. Um, and I think communicating that and helping people get that ability, gain that ability, really increases their effectiveness when they try to consume content. And yeah, I love what I do, and this stuff to me is just a bunch of fun. And I think another important thing, and I think y'all are the same way, that at least that's what I've picked up on. Um, I love all this, but I'm not emotionally attached to any of the outcomes or findings. Like, um, and maybe I think I am, maybe I think I'm not, maybe I actually am, but I think it's pretty cool when it could go either way and it doesn't really matter to you. The biggest risk is, oh, I was wrong that time, but I'm also pretty okay with that as well. Um, so I guess if I could get to the paper that you brought up, the dose response paper that um, we published in 2023. For me, this is a paper that was a long time coming. And this paper, for those who haven't read it or aren't familiar with it, we questioned the dose response relationship between training volume and muscle growth. Um, and it was really, I use this kind of as an example to focus on really looking at muscle growth outcomes and trying to understand those muscle growth outcomes. And I think that's where a lot of the misinterpretation of this paper's come from. Um, and I think it's, defensiveness against the idea and not maybe saying, okay, I disagree with their conclusion, but I understand the difference of perspective of trying to understand the research from the perspective of someone who measures muscles every day. And that's kind of what I intended the paper to do. And if it's done that or not, I'm not really certain. I've had a lot of good discussions from this paper, so I think that's awesome. And I've heard a lot of discussions that I don't think were productive around this paper as well. Um, but anyway, for me, a lot of the data just, and maybe you guys are the same. When I read a paper, there's like I'll say to myself, or I say to my students, this is interesting, but this doesn't move the needle for me. And it might be because of a little nuanced detail in the paper or an outcome that just I can't rationalize. I can't make sense of it. And when that happens for me, I kind of file it in interesting, but I'm not putting too much weight in this. And for me, a lot of the data on the dose response relationship, it just kind of looked a little all over the place. Some studies show it, some studies don't show it. Some studies that show it showed it way too strongly, like in a way that I just I want to see that replicated. Um, and for that reason, we wrote this paper, and it was to kind of point to some of the specific data and say, okay, the growth that was observed in this study is larger than what most labs are seeing. It doesn't mean it's not real, but it means it's interesting to me, and it means I approach this particular piece of evidence with caution. Um, and that particular point, I think, has received quite a bit of criticism. But I stand by it. When I see a zero point 0.7 centimeter increase in vastus lateralis muscle thickness, right? I don't know if you guys think about that number. Is that an impressive number to you?
So I have had the privilege of measuring biceps, triceps, calves for studies that I've led, and therefore been the primary investigator doing the ultrasound scans. Zach, you have done the
Yeah.
quads, but you did a different measurement
Yeah.
approach than just typical muscle thickness.
I would say, yeah, I haven't done isolated
Like
vascular
that exact same measurement
I haven't done to the same
method.
degree. The thing I will say that I think does always come in with these conversations is it's just another aspect of things where the exact measurement technique, like you've discussed, is just so vitally important.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even when a given absolute growth is given, slight differences in the technique and where you're drawing your borders. Like, for example, I've seen across the literature, you'll see individual muscles given. So vastus lateralis muscle thickness. You'll see the lateral compartment of the quadriceps, which, depending on the angle of the probe, depending on the exact location in which you're taking muscle size, can include multiple heads of the quadricep, which you're going all the way down to the bone. And so those absolute numbers get very tricky to know whether they are reasonable or not in the context of the exact way the measurement was taken, the site at which that was taken, all of these other contextual factors. So I completely understand what you're saying in the sense that there are going to be growths that ultimately are extremely high on the absolute end of the spectrum. But without going into those nuances in an extreme detail, I have a hard time placing any one isolated number and saying like this is, abnormally high, given I wasn't there to understand every single aspect of that. And that's where I just think there's a limitation across studies where methods are just not adequately described enough. And that's, it's a tough aspect of things, which isn't a totally satisfying answer, but that's kind of one of the things that come to mind for me.
From a high level, though, I think we very much just agree with the larger point of that is generally how we look at research these days, whereas maybe when we started to get involved with research a little bit, but we didn't really understand the full peek behind the curtain in terms of what goes into hypertrophy studies. You just look at it with a different lens now. You're like, which way did they hold the probe of the ultrasound, for example? How confident am I that they properly calibrated the number of pixels on the images that they measured in ImageJ or some other software? Those are the things that we think about these days, and we might go back and forth. And that's a similar perspective that you have. And I think it is important to communicate those sorts of things because for that reason, because we know that things can go awry, and we're not saying anything has gone awry in any particular case, but there are almost certainly cases where things have gone awry and therefore the data is invalidated in isolation. I don't know when that's occurred. I don't know how often it has occurred, but I can say with full confidence that it has occurred at some point. So that is why I think we hold a similar value here. Like you said, Sam, that like any individual study is, I don't want to say useless by any means, because that's a little bit depressing, but it is quite. We shouldn't put too much stock into any individual outcome. So I think we hold that value very similarly to you, and that's something I know you've done a lot of work on. And like for example, last time we spoke, we were talking about holding the ultrasound probe horizontally, if you will, compared to vertically. And we went back and forth about that a little bit. And you're like, yeah, for the study we're doing right now, we're actually doing both. And that's something that we would do as well, because we're like, we're not sure, and we kind of want to see both. So we tend to agree on that front.
And the thing that's just so interesting to me, and we don't want to turn this into a measurement roundtable, but like these are kind of the black box. Like I've had so many conversations with like everybody that does hypertrophy research about measuring ultrasounds, and there's like so many of these like trade secrets that like nobody kind of like talks about, and like just isn't adequately described enough in papers, I think, that give people maybe a kind of just a little bit more pause with understanding the things that go into the measurements. And I don't think that comes from a malicious place necessarily, but it comes from people like us that, not to say we're doing it better than everybody else by any means, but like being extremely aware of like choices that we're making and realizing there's potentially other ways to do it that could have trade-offs and have pros and cons, and just like all these different assumptions that essentially go into a measurement protocol, that it kind of creates this black box of measurement that I think just gives a little bit more uncertainty to the whole picture of the hypertrophy equation that just kind of is the undertone of the paper you're kind of mentioning, Sam. And I think to kind of the steel man, the point of the paper, at least that I got from it, is ultimately you're not calling into question in terms of like any one causative factor of why the changes are a certain way, but it's more so that, hey, if we see this general pattern of growth and that's what I come to expect, this is on the upper end of that and would conceivably bring in other possibilities of why this is the case, is essentially what I got from it. And volume was the vehicle here, but understanding the absolute changes in muscle size are going to give you an indication of when the training effects may be more quote-unquote believable than in other cases. And that's really the point that I got from it. The volume aspect of it was the vehicle that was delivered, but I don't know if that was really the point I got from it necessarily. It's just take into context the absolute changes that you're seeing relative to what we would expect from the broader literature at large, and make sure you're keeping that in the back of your mind when you're analyzing any one, training study outcome. Would you say that's a relatively accurate picture?
Yeah, I think so. I think we wanted people to read this and have a better ability to critically evaluate what they're consuming, and then maybe weigh things differently. And for some people, it wouldn't change anything. And I've heard that some people think, well, the effect is just that strong. You're going to get a lot of growth if you do high volume. And that's fine. I think that could be true. I don't necessarily think that that's true, but that's a possibility. And I think our perspective is also a possibility. Um, and I don't know if I caused this. Um, this whole swelling stuff is I don't know if it comes from my paper. I don't know if it's caused by my paper. I was thinking about that over the past couple of days because I've noticed a lot of discussion on swelling and volume research, and we put that as a hypothesis in our paper. And I think I told you guys last time we were together and we were speaking. I don't necessarily think that volume's playing a large role in the volume research, or swelling is playing a large role in the volume research. I think it could be, um, and for me, just based on my experience, I thought it was just as reasonable as a possibility as zero point 0.7 centimeters of growth. And again, that's just coming from the perspective of I've taken that measurement and it's 3 to 4 times what I've gotten in the change score. So for me, right, that is a reasonable hypothesis. Is it a likely hypothesis? Maybe not, but to me, it's as reasonable as the idea that you could get that magnitude of growth. And I know I've done different examples to give people an example of how my brain works. The bologna, I don't know if it was effective or not last time I was on a podcast with you, Josh. But I was thinking about other ways to express like how my mind thinks about it. When I see 0.7 centimeters of growth, if you could repeat that 3 times, I think 3 times is the example I've used previously, that's 2.1 centimeters of growth. Y'all have measured biceps. Some female biceps are around 2.5 centimeters, right? So if you can experience that much growth in 8 weeks, how many times a year could you replicate that? I don't think you could replicate it twice. If you extended the study 8 weeks, let's say you extended the study to 24 weeks, you're not capturing that again and again and again and again. You captured it once. And I'm very skeptical of it happening once. Because again, for me, that change is very robust and very impressive. And I think what you said, Zach, is important. Differences in technique have to explain some of this, right? But objectively, that's still a large amount of muscle. Like you could put it anywhere, and it's a large amount. And I've thought about it because if you're measuring the lateral thigh, and you move your probe up and down, it tapers, and a small difference in placement of your probe could get you a drastically different number, right? And sometimes it's hard to trace these to the right anatomical site, right? It's just a limitation of research. And again, it doesn't mean any of these things are true. My mind considers all of these possibilities, when I look at these change scores. I had another one. I think I might have lost my other idea I had. But regardless, I think these are reasonable criticisms, and I don't think they have to be emotional. I think it's just one researcher's perspective on a change.
Yeah, I think, man, there's so many ways we could take this. I think it might be the most helpful for the sake of discussion to maybe just think of high volume outcomes in general, and the fact that, okay, in the studies that have explored higher volumes, let's just say for sake of discussion, that's like above 20 sets a week. In general, those seem to outperform the lower volume conditions in those same studies. Of course, there are exceptions, but that was kind of the point of our meta-regressions, is to try to see where the balances lie, if you will. So if we just think of high volume research in general, and okay, on average, slightly greater effects, or might be even worth saying meaningfully greater effects, I think it's a fair point to consider some of the implications of that, because even if we were to use a smaller absolute change value, so instead of 0.7, if we were to use 0.2, I think you could make the same comment about really any notable or detectable change in hypertrophy over a 10-week study about how often can this actually be repeated. So if it is a value of 0.7, you might say, man, repeating that twice is crazy, let alone over the course of the next year. So repeating that, 5 times. I think you could even say that about a change of 0.2, right? you would just have to repeat it more and more times. But obviously, there's kind of this asymptotic relationship between your training career and additional increases in muscle size. So one way to view this, and I think you were alluding to that Revive Stronger roundtable that we did, which I think was quite fruitful. One way to view this is to say, okay, obviously this isn't just infinitely repeatable. So one perspective would be, if we can get pretty big changes, no matter what the group is, in a short-term study, that can give us some indication of how to train over the long term and reach a higher peak. Another perspective would be, and this could apply for volume, this could apply for range of motion, this could apply for proximity to failure. Another perspective would be, okay, a 10 or 12-week study, I don't really care if it shows meaningful differences as long as it was productive and it did lead to meaningful hypertrophy. I'm probably going to end up at the same spot anyway. And I think that's a very valid question because we're quite time constrained in terms of research. And I'm curious your perspective, and I don't mean to completely dichotomize those two perspectives, but you're probably going to lean into one camp more than the other. To put our cards on the table, Zach and I would probably lean more towards the, hey, this is going to give us at least some degree of indication of what to do over the long term, even if it's clearly not infinitely repeatable. So I'm curious where you might fall, and I think your perspective is especially valuable here because, to my understanding, you are interested in, and may even be in the process of doing some work kind of looking at this exact question of longer-term time courses of muscle growth.
Yeah, sure. First, I think your point is great, and I agree with it. This idea that if any research study was repeatable, I think we'd all be a lot bigger. So it's fascinating to me. It's curious to me that you get a group of trained people, and over 8 weeks, they pretty consistently. I mean, if you look at the average, and I did this, the average change in muscle size for trained people, biceps is 0.23. That's 31 exercise conditions. That's an unweighed average change.
Would that be like 6% maybe?
They probably started around 4 centimeters, 4.2. I don't have that.
I don't do public math, so I'll leave that one to you. But we can let the listener do it.
But anyway, it's interesting that in a fixed period of time you can capture that, but the repeatability of that doesn't seem to be necessarily be the case. And I gave a talk at UCF a few months ago where we discussed these things, and I was really interested to get. There's a lot of great researchers at UCF that study muscle growth, study body composition, and I was interested to get their feedback as well of like, are we just capturing this moment in time where we have hyper focused training and things are made a little bit more ideal, and we're capturing growth, and that growth is just a blip that we can achieve it. We're going to eventually lose it when we lose focus, and then we can regain it if we focus again. And maybe this is a horrible view of research, but the more and more I think about it, I lean towards it that it's not something you can extrapolate linearly. And I think everyone would agree with that.
Yeah.
Just I do think it can inform practices, but I think as a scientific community, like sometimes we roll with something and we'll reach a conclusion that may not be appropriate. If higher volume was better in this 8-week period, is it equalized over a year anyway? Because if you had more a greater rate of growth over 8 weeks, what's the likely? Is that group just going to slow, and then the other group's just going to catch up to it, kind of slow and steady? Sometimes research isn't interpreted in the context of a larger picture. And if I can give an example of just how I'm thinking right now, a lot of these training, detraining, retraining studies have become popular. A lot of people talk about them, and sometimes the interpretation is, well, you can take X amount of time off and you're fine. You'll gain it back in 8 weeks. It's like, well, the actual interpretation of that study is, no, that little bit you gained in this 8 weeks, you can gain back in this 8 weeks. But if you're a high level bodybuilder and you take time off and you like, it's different to recapture this small thing that happened here and have it repeat than it is to detrain and have a much different ceiling. Because a lot of these studies are taking untrained people, train them, detrain, retrain. It's like what you're losing and reacquiring is a very small amount of tissue. And um, sometimes the conclusion we reach and the thing we tell people may not match the reality, because the reality of any conclusion we can give people with certainty is this 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 week in rare circumstances concept. Um, and Josh, I can share what we've found in our year-long study.
Ooh.
It's I can share some of it at least. I presented it at Trainology over the summer, but yeah, we and I need to do more analysis for sure. But it's like 31 people, and over 12 months, we didn't have growth. No growth.
How well trained?
Pretty well trained. I mean, the average training age was 8 years. Um, and we took an interesting approach. They had to be training and they had to be doing bicep curls. So like, and this might lead to a discussion in a few minutes on direct versus indirect, because I know you all talked about it in your paper. But you've been training your biceps, and we want you to keep training your biceps, and we're just going to see what happens. And they had to do, at least 2 sessions a week, at least two sets per session, but they exceeded that. Everyone that approached bicep curls typically did at least 3 or 4 sets. Um, and when you look at the data, and we have the control groups that are going to help us interpret this, I think, a little bit better. But there's, it looks like individuals did this over time. I mean, there were moments they came in and maybe their muscle appeared a little bit larger. There's times where it wasn't as large, and they seem to fluctuate around a value throughout the year. And when you think about it, if you try to capture adaptations over a year, these are students, they have final exams. How much money do they have to, what's their diet like?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of limitations to our study. But it shows that people that are training, and these are people that trained and enjoyed training, I presume, we're largely maintaining over a year, and I don't think that means, and I don't think the takeaway from this study will be that you don't grow. you know I I think it's going to be that growth is a little bit messier than we think. It's not linear like we'd expect it to be necessarily. um, and for each individual, there's probably things that explain why, okay, at month 4 you peaked, you know whatever happened in your life thereafter. But and um, I haven't run a whole lot of stats on this data yet, but I think the overall conclusion is going to be people with advanced training age don't see large amounts of muscle growth or meaningful muscle growth over a year. And you know, this whole idea for me, and I don't know if I shared this on the last podcast, Josh, but I worked in a muscle lab where we did a lot of biceps research. So for 4 years, I knew my bicep size, right? Sounds corny, but like if you work in a lab and you pilot on yourself and then you do this study and that study, I would guess what it's going to be before they measured it. If I did an acute study, you get to know, then and there what it is. And I, so I tracked my muscles over 4 years, and I trained my muscles for 4 years. But at that end of that 4 year period, my biceps were the same. And I haven't measured them in 5 or 6 years, honestly. My students have practiced, but I don't know the numbers. I don't think I'm proud of them anymore. Um, but I think if I think they're probably close to where they were. But if I got back to training with the frequency and volume that I used to, I think they'll go back up to what they were during grad school when I trained feverishly. And I think that's about it. And I guess it ties into this, what is the potential for muscle growth? When does muscle stop growing? Because certainly that has to be, at least I think that has to be true, right? Um, it seems like we have mechanisms that put a governor on our capacity to growth. And I think that's a good thing. Maybe our year-long study captured this in a sense. or maybe there's a completely other explanation. And I also use all this data to inform when I try to interpret and break down all these hypertrophy studies.
Yeah. I have a lot of follow-ups, but I'm going to let you say anything you want, Zach.
Short 2 cents.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I just love the places and types of questions that you seem interested in. I think they're extremely valuable. They're not the sexy questions that are able to give you a look at a very specific variable in 8 weeks, but these are the types of things that I think have the potential to really help us take a step back and view things from a bird's eye view with more clarity. And those are the types of projects that I just think are really, really helpful because it can inspire just better principled thinking about all this stuff and how to inform recommendations like that. So I think first and foremost, I think that's a really, really cool study to do. Takes a lot of man hours, and obviously, I'm sure that you're aware, probably doing the ultrasounds yourself, that was probably a lot of time invested in something that's not necessarily rewarded to put all that time and effort in. So that's a really, really cool project. Congrats on doing that. It sounds really, really interesting to read, and I'm excited to see the other results. But yeah, there are so many follow-ups and ultimate questions and things that kind of come from that are just, again, more fruitful. And I'm going to try not to ask too many follow-ups because it sounds like Josh has got a pretty good list here. But yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. I think understanding those longitudinal trends of growth, I think I would generally agree that it almost certainly has to be an asymptotic relationship. And my personal position on kind of the snapshot in time in terms of these training variables that we look at is they probably increase the rate of growth to the same asymptotic point, but in a practical applied scenario in a time-bound world in which we all focus on training for different periods in our life, it may practically allow you to reach a higher peak only because of the fact that the rate is a little bit faster.
Yeah.
If we were able to have an infinite experiment with zero constraints, I don't necessarily think we reach a different point. I think you probably reach that asymptote at some point, and that's just, nature's kind of lottery ticket that you have, unfortunately. But in an applied scenario, I think there's a theoretical case to be made that accelerated rate may let you reach that peak. But I also think it's totally reasonable that we reach that peak a lot faster than I think people want to admit, for all of us that have kind of this sunken cost in the muscle world. And maybe part of the game is just finding the most efficient training to maintain that asymptotic peak level of fitness as much as possible. So
Yeah.
there's a lot.
I'll kind of piggyback off that and try to come at this from an optimistic perspective, because I try to be optimistic.
Got Black Pill Bill and Sam over here. Let's go.
Yeah, I want to be as optimistic as possible here, because I try to be just optimistic in general, and I think it's a fair counterpoint that I tend to align with a decent bit, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, Sam. So to your point, you take a step back and if we just take a basic look at the example here of folks that have been training for 8 years, they consistently train their biceps, but they don't change all that much. Another observation might be that we know, or at least we think we know, that good training is almost certainly better than worse training, right? By definition, they're like I think that is something that I would believe to be true. Good training is better than worse training, and we do see examples, and probably the best look at this, just because they get down to very low levels of body fat, so you can get the best look possible, is very well trained, experienced natural bodybuilders. And at least we think we see these folks continue to improve deep into a training career. And there's a lot of things that could be going on there. But I would probably adopt the view that it's probably, at least to some degree, an increase in muscle size. And we see this in coaching practices all the time. Someone might be lifting when they come to you, but by the time you get them training and training properly, and improvements in techniques, improvements in exercise technique, improvements in just how to structure a workout, etc. These basic things definitely improve outcomes. So the point I'm circling around here is that I think we would all be on board that to some degree good training is better than worse training. But then we also are saying, hey, there's kind of this diminishing returns effect over time and maybe something resemble an asymptote. So my question for you, Sam, is like, what is the alternative for identifying what is better training, or at least our best guess for what better training is? Because if I was to steelman someone that does make, content, and especially these days where, people have, or at least we make the claim that people have shorter attention spans, and we do this to some degree as well. Hey, this study showed better results from X protocol versus Y protocol. This might be a good idea to follow X protocol. But we would all kind of push back as scientists to say like, oh, there's a ton of limitations to this. Keep this in mind. But again, to steelman that content-based approach, if you will, is what's the alternative, right? What's the alternative approach for making training recommendations? Because training recommendation, we need to train even before we know we have all the answers, and we're never going to have all the answers. So A, does that question make sense? If not, I can clarify. And B, I'm curious your thoughts on that kind of really practical piece of this.
Mm-hmm. Let me tackle the practical part first.
Sure.
Because I think I have an idea. I don't know if it's good. But yeah, when I say I think we're capturing this phenomena that may not be necessarily repeatable, I think it's still real in some cases. So you use the example of a bodybuilder. A bodybuilder peaks, so they don't need to hold on to growth year round. They need to express the most muscle that they can on show day. And I've been thinking about this because Holly competes, and I don't know if you guys ever sat in a show with someone in it. It's nerve-wracking. Um, but it's made me think about, okay, what does she need to do to maximize everything she needs to maximize to win these shows? And I tend to think hyper-focused training for periods of time might be able to get your muscle to its max, but I just tend to think that's not sustainable. So where you can chill is right here. Where you started was here. Where you can chill is here. For a short period of time, you can fly here. Soar with the eagles, right? That's kind of how I think of it, because again, we could put someone like her or another high-level bodybuilder, and maybe we can measure what we think is real growth. But how long can you hold on to that? And the reason I think, especially if you're a natural athlete, if you're making yourself larger, that's not good for survival. Your body's not going to want to hold on to that. And maybe it does take this high amount of volume to achieve that. Um, I don't think that's sustainable, and I don't think that's linear. I think it's more of a, okay, we can get here. How long can we stay here long enough to do these two shows? And then ultimately our body's gonna need a break. We can go back to something more normal, less focused. That's kind of how I think of a lot of these studies, practically speaking. I view them as a snapshot, and I think they might be at least on that upper level. And what that means maybe to someone that wants to utilize that data. Um, Outside of that, I mean, I think our principles are what they are. I think I guess if we're keeping it to volume, um, you know, it's pinpointing, um, how do we communicate it, and what does this data mean? Um, I think volume's a tool, and I think maybe it does, as y'all suggested, increase the rate of growth. Um, but long term, like, what does it actually mean for people? Maybe less than some people would suggest. Um, are you never going to realize your full potential without that volume? Maybe not. But again, I think I would view it as a brief moment, as opposed to um, a change that you're going to continue to stepwise up.
Yeah. I think volume's kind of a tricky one here, because it is like contentious. You could doubt the nature of the dose response relationship. Maybe a thought experiment that would be helpful here, something that I think unanimously folks would be on board with. So something like technique, and I'm not saying like it has to be some perfect technique, but I think everyone would agree that there is a threshold of technique for something like a bicep curl in order to properly train the biceps or decently train the biceps. So where my mind goes with this, with your framework of thinking about training studies, is that sure, higher volumes might get you to soar with the eagles kind of above your chill point temporarily, but it might be hard to sustain that. And you're kind of proposing this model of muscle size is a bit more dynamic. But I guess let me start with maybe a simpler question: is do you think that chill point is modifiable, or do you think once you've been training for 5 to 10 years, that is more or less predetermined?
That's a good question. I don't know. Um, would be the honest answer. I I would hope it's modifiable. I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it's most modifiable during puberty, honestly. I think the more you do while you're developing, the greater your capacity to walk around larger. Like, um, you know, I think that's when we have the greatest plasticity. So someone who trained and did sports while they're developing and growing, I think their chill point might be higher than the person that started, after college lifting,
Yeah.
and there's going to be cases where that's not true, obviously. Um, but will years of training change your, I guess so the new scientific term is the chill point. Um, I don't know. Maybe with enough time, but I don't know what mechanism would determine this.
Yeah.
What in your physiology is determining, okay, this amount of tissue is a comfortable amount of tissue that we're going to hold on to and we're going to allocate resources to it. If you
Yeah.
do change it, eventually it's going to start decreasing anyway as you age. So, um, you know, I yeah, I
Yeah.
don't have a good
Let's
answer for that
It's
one.
definitely adapts downward with
Yeah.
age, right? So
Let me take it one step further. I think this chill point, and just to maybe loosely define this for the listener, it's like I don't think we would adopt a strict definition of like a natty limit, but let's just say the point where it's quite hard to
I was going to
gain
call it maximal sustainable adaptation.
maximal sustainable adaptation. Perfect.
Yeah.
But we're just kind of thinking about it kind of hand wavy
Yeah.
for sake of discussion here.
Yeah.
It has to be modifiable to some degree because not training will not get you there, right? So therefore, training is a modifiable factor in your environment, if you will, that's going to get you to that chill point. Here's the question, and I don't know if this will resonate with you guys in terms of the point I'm getting at with this question. So maybe it's a swing and a miss here, or maybe I hit a home run. We'll see. But what determines the threshold of training stimulus to get to that chill point? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Because there's obviously if you only do bicep curls like this, and for the listener, I'm just swinging my arm around, I'm probably not going to get to my chill point.
The issue I was going to say with exercise technique, the tough part with that is it's essentially volume in disguise.
Exactly. And dosage, I almost think of all of this as dosage, right? You can obviously
Yeah.
do more sets, but you can also just better train the target muscle.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like, the question comes down to is there a point at which the dosage of like total dosage, volume, exercise selection, just put all the variables in a bucket and just call it like effective dosage or whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, the question is there a point at which the maintenance dose to make that the maximum sustainable adaptation is exceeding what you can sustain? That's what it comes down to. Because if you're not able to sustain what is required to maintain, then you're going to ultimately not be able to sustain that amount of muscle mass. So
I'm still thinking about I'm still trying to focus in on the point of like good versus or like better versus worse training.
I mean, to me, like all that does is like theoretically it does one of two things. One, better training is going to accelerate the rate at which you reach the
Chill
maximum
point.
sustainable adaptation or chill point, whatever you want to call it. And then you're just going to be able to maintain that with a variety of training programs, because all it did is just accelerate the rate. But the other one would have got you there just in a slower time. That's option A. Or option 2 is the efficacy of the training stimulus of something that isn't as theoretically optimized just never has enough stimulus or power to get you up to that level. And given that the variety of training anecdotes, the black pill part of my brain is like, I feel like if you're training progressively within reasonable constraints for the adaptation you're trying to optimize, like I just have a hard time seeing that it's not just a modification in the rate, which I still think in a practical scenario can still lead to like a higher theoretical ceiling personally. And I think that's ultimately what happens a lot of the time is like at the end of the day, like we don't focus on training as much as we do throughout our lives. And so you essentially have a time-bound goal at which you're willing to commit as many resources as humanly possible. And so when that's the case, those rates also influence the absolute magnitude of things you can achieve. So that's my personal view on it, honestly.
I think a pretty common anecdote, though, is people like continuing to progress quite deep into their training.
And so that to me is where I think we probably differ a little bit, just because.
Yeah, like, I don't know. Maybe this is just me being too optimistic.
Like,
but
I just think about like.
I again think of the alternative. Is the alternative just to like?
But that's not a good reason, though. I'm not trying to play both sides here, but
yeah.
Like to me,
this is how the podcast goes.
Yeah,
Dr. Buckner.
Like to me, that's not
Zach and I just end up arguing.
I mean, ultimately, your point is well taken. Like you have to do something, and I think whether or not it reaches a asymptote essentially, and you get to the same point, like training more efficaciously is going to be something most people are probably going to want to know.
Yeah, and
there's honestly, the answer I thought Sam was going to give initially was like, there's just no way we can ascertain that information, which is the honest scientific answer. And
hat tip.
Yeah, it's like, man, like what can we use 8 to 12 week training studies to inform how we should train over a 20 to 25 year period? If you look at the percentage of time that we've explored relative to that time, it's like, man, it's really hard. But obviously we have to do something. And I think it's just with that uncertainty in mind, you just have to play a probability game, and it's not a game of certainty. And I think that's where it's tough.
Now that we've created a dumpster fire, we'll see what you think.
I should have wrote down my thoughts I had along the way with this. I'm going to bring it back to something else that's I think has to be part of this conversation. And that's not just the fact that we study these things over 8 to 12 weeks, but are we studying them in a way that's actually beneficial for folks? And I'll tell you what I mean. And I don't think y'all's analysis did this. Maybe it did. But I think another important thing is how many exercises made up that volume, right? So if you have a study and their frequency is twice a week and their volume is 52 sets, but they only have 2 exercises, right? In my mind, that limits the stimulus you can provide. If it had 4 exercises, in my mind, that increases the stimulus it could provide. And I think another huge issue with drawing actual applications to training is how research just does not resemble what people do. And the example I'll give is my volume recommendations on our last podcast, Josh. Everyone was surprised because they were amongst the highest. Well, that's where my belief comes in, because I don't have data, right? We all have to make a decision on what we're compelled to believe based on our experience. And I'm compelled to believe that I don't just do 2 exercises for my quads. I like variety of movements. And my assumption there is that this exercise provides some benefit that this other exercise doesn't. So some of this volume, not all of it, some of this volume is a novel stimulus for the muscle. And maybe y'all can share if you did this, but you had the volume studies. Did you run any analysis for number of exercises or exercise variety, and what did that yield?
Yeah, so any of the super deep divers can download the full Excel data set, and there's a column, it's identified as number of unique exercises or
for hypertrophy.
for
specifically.
hypertrophy. Actually, don't quote me on that. Now that I say that, it might have been a slightly different variable, but you can figure it out if you dive into the supplementary materials. But the short answer is yes. So we went through and we said, okay, if this study measured quadriceps hypertrophy and they did leg press, hack squat, and leg extension, for that outcome specifically, the number of contributing exercises is 3, right? So we did do a sub-analysis of that variable in which we took the 10th percentile of the number of contributing exercises and the 90th percentile. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it was 1 in 6.
To be clear, all the information is utilized. That's just how it's visualized. Yeah.
Yeah, all the information is utilized, but it's estimated at those 10th and 90th percentiles. But the short answer in terms of what we found is that there wasn't a clear indication one way or the other that only doing 1 or 2 exercises at a given volume versus more than that, 5 or 6, say, led to better hypertrophy, or what's more accurate here is a tangible difference in the dose-response relationship. But we've emphasized this on previous episodes. Those sub-analyses are just incredibly limited. We could all go on for 2 hours about why it's arguably useless, and that's kind of the position we adopt. So I don't intend to point that sub-analysis out to say that I disagree with you, Sam. I would tend to agree, even if it's just for decreasing training monotony. It's pretty hard to go sit there and do eight sets on one exercise if that's a volume you want to get done in a session.
Even if it's just like the range of motion stuff has been beat to death at this point, but like different resistance profiles and things like that, like with regional hypertrophy being conceivably a thing, I think that's like a pretty
I tend to agree. But this is kind of circling back to the point I keep coming back to is you kind of baked into that point you made, Sam, that training, these volume studies might not resemble real world training for multiple reasons. One of those reasons is that no one's going to do 10 sets on an exercise. They're going to split that up into 2, 3, maybe even 4 exercises. Again, we would probably tend to agree with that. But to me, baked into that is a principle or some sort of indication of better versus worse training. And in this case, I guess just to put it simply, that probably more exercise variety to some degree would be beneficial. Again, we would agree with that, but I guess my question is like, where does that come from? Because if we say that 10-week studies or 12-week studies are quite limited in terms of our ability to apply those, aren't we also limited in looking at 10 to 12-week studies on, say, exercise variety? Or maybe those do inform it, but that variable is something that is quite helpful when looking at 8 to 12-week studies, but other variables aren't. Does that question make sense?
I think so. And the way I'll try to answer it, I don't think science has answered this question necessarily. I think logic can largely kind of fill in the lines, or dots, whatever the phrase is. But this is largely my whole perspective kind of comes from this. And the recent baseline training volume paper that I did, I approached it really differently because selfishly, these new recommendations affect my research, right? So my perspective on this commentary paper, on my recent volume paper, which was just focusing on the biceps, comes from the fact that when I do research, and a lot of my research is in untrained individuals, have them do a bicep curl, right? It's really controlled. They're doing one exercise, and I want to look at the growth. So what I want to do is I want to maximize what they can get out of that exercise. And I believe, I'm not saying I'm correct, but I believe somewhere around the 3rd or 4th set to a near failure, I think they could keep doing sets, but I don't see compelling data to suggest to me that they're going to keep getting gains. Right? There's a point where you've maximized muscle protein synthesis in the fibers involved in that movement. So that's the reason that just my logic suggests that, okay, if you kept adding volume, but you're adding just the same thing, that volume to me doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But if you added the volume and the volume were of a different variety, if you change the exercise, a slight variation, you're probably utilizing some of the muscle that's largely you already maximize the muscle purring synthetic response. But there's probably other aspects that maybe you haven't, right? So maybe between these two movements, you've increased the likelihood that you're getting a homogeneous growth stimulus across the muscle belly. This is what I think. I'm not saying I have evidence to prove this.
Yeah.
But that's the reason that my volume recommendations were higher than yours. Probably not by a lot, but because, when someone asks me, okay, what are your volume recommendations? Like, I'm basing it on data that's not how you train. And I'm not going to tell you just to do, I think of it of a exercise per exercise basis. That's always my starting point. And then, so a weekly volume recommendation, I think it makes sense to a coach working with a client where you have what they're doing. But for a scientific discussion, weekly volume, I think, can sometimes be problematic. And we're jumping around.
Just to
I think
chime in with a little bit of context on that analysis, just because I looked it up. This is kind of what I remembered is the comparison at the 10th and the 90th percentile was 1 versus 3.
1 versus 3. It was a pretty small
there's
range.
like basically, exactly. The point being, I think this is probably a pretty open question that hasn't been totally isolated, which I think is honestly really interesting. If you basically try to control everything else, but the only thing you manipulate is the number of exercises that you're contributing, and then you have a third arm potentially that increases volume with those exercises versus volume at the other.
Like I think what you're suggesting, Sam, like I think Zach and I tend to agree that like maybe we would have differences in terms of just how we conceptualize like quantifying the training dose, but I at the very least your point is well taken that maybe sets per exercise is worth considering just as much as sets per session or sets per week, because there's good reason to believe that there are different, at the very least, regions of the muscle that are receiving the bulk of the stimulus, if not completely different muscles, depending on the exercises in question. And you mentioned that logic kind of fills in the gaps there, right? So like, I guess put another way, we strongly agree with a lot of these limitations. Perhaps where there's a slight difference in terms of just the way we think about research and application of the research is where to go from those limitations. You have, I think, sound reasoning, reasoning that we totally respect and that definitely passes the sniff test in terms of here's what I'm going to do instead of just taking some number from a meta-analysis, which we also wouldn't do. But we would probably still lean into what the research suggests directly a little bit more than maybe you do. And that's where I'm just trying to maybe start a conversation around where to go from those limitations, because I think that has a ton of tangible implications for science communication.
The thing I found interesting, because I understand what you're saying, Josh, is you're essentially trying to the primary difference in the practical perspective here is how do you deal with the space that is created by uncertainty. That's what it comes down to.
Well said, yes.
That said, we've been on the record, at least my current position, I believe you agree with this, the current main utility of research in the training context is to give us directional principles. That's generally speaking how I view the primary application of it. Exact magnitudes in direct prescriptions get a lot messier for a lot of the reasons Sam has already said. Doesn't exactly mirror the training interventions that we're trying to mimic in the real world, et cetera, but it gives you a controlled look at what is the directional relationship of this principle and how can that generally be reflected in practice. I actually think both of you guys agree with that. Like, it just is being manifested in a slightly different way, potentially. Is like, there's ultimately a consideration that Sam's bringing up, which I honestly think is a good one, that could color the directional, relationship that is created there. Is like, you guys are both saying that to some degree, a greater dose is going to lead to more hypertrophy. It's just, where is that dose coming from and what does it look like? So it's And I think both of those can be debated because of the space that uncertainty remains. And if you want to fill that with logic and or rationalistic principles from your observations, your training experience,
Fair
etc.,
enough.
versus, I'm going to take the assumption that these training studies do generalize in some way to the space that is created by that uncertainty. I don't really think there's a right or wrong answer there. Like, I think one could probably create some sort of like prediction track record in a way, like of the times we had a space left for uncertainty and we had a rationalist or logic driven case for what we should do and a evidence, maybe assumed generalizable.
Empiricist.
Yeah. If you have those two cases and there's past examples where there was space for it and now we have filled said space and could kind of what is the generalizability of these principles that we ultimately take when we're able to examine these things on a longer time scale. I think you could maybe have a leaning in one of the two directions. I have no idea what that number is, honestly, but theoretically that would be the way that I would probably lean on one versus the other. Obviously, in the case of driving things based on logic and your rationalistic experience, you have all the human-driven biases that, we all agree science is a powerful tool. That's why we're scientists in the first place. But Josh and I are also not the type of people to say, swing the science sword and realize there are very, very clear limitations to researching longitudinal outcomes, particularly from a measurement perspective, which Sam is obviously extremely familiar with. So, I don't know. I feel like you guys are saying very similar things. It's just maybe from a slightly different perspective. And at the end of the day, that space, that uncertainty is kind of just something that is always going to be there, and there's never going to be a satisfying answer, unfortunately. Thoughts?
I'll just add that measuring a difference from different approaches would be so hard to do anyway. The likelihood of detecting it over 8 to 12 weeks, I think, is almost not going to happen. And I'm skeptical when I read some of these regional differences because you have different reliability across the muscle belly. I'm sure you all have experienced this. Like distal growth, the muscle tapers and you have connective tissue. That's harder to measure. Proximal growth, you all ever try to measure the top of the bicep? It's horrific. It takes a lot of practice.
Some people's front delts are really weird up in that area too.
Individualized anatomy, that's like one of the biggest things we've talked about through
we've
more muscles.
So like in some of the studies that I've led, I'm going to add in the supplementary materials like the distance between the two anatomical marks because I had to individualize them to get them to the part of the muscle belly that I wanted. And like when I just see 40%, I'm like, that just doesn't really work out. If you want to measure.
And therein lies the issue with kind of what I was saying earlier about like methods being kind of this black box and saying like theoretically, Sam, I know you probably would still disagree with this, but just conceivably, let's say you were measuring the most distal aspect of the quads humanly possible, and someone's calling that 70%.
Right.
Whereas the way that they measured it, the way they ultimately analyzed the humerus, or not the humerus, the femur length, and they actually said their 70% is much closer to the middle part of the quad. That absolute amount of growth that you're dealing with now completely biases your kind of internal sense of the magnitude of that growth, which is, again, we're just like more transparent measurement techniques, visuals when applicable, the type of stuff that you're doing, and just like someone seeing that, be like, oh, this is complicated. Like that, those types of things are just like, I just feel like are really good for the overall sanity and making sure people don't interpret things too literally. And I think it's really important for this conversation because there's a lot of talk about kind of mechanistic driven versus outcome driven decision making with this kind of stuff. And I would say as a general principle, I lean on the outcome driven stuff, but that's only when you can really, really well approximate the outcomes. And for hypertrophy, I think that's something that is maybe just gone a little bit under-recognized.
Let me take a particular point that you made, Sam. Try to like repeat back how I understand it in the most like good faith way possible and see if I'm on track here with the way you think about this. So a particular point you made is that once you do 3 or 4 sets for an exercise, you've more or less maximize the muscle protein synthetic response, or just put simply the hypertrophic benefit you're going to get from that exercise. And to some degree, that isn't necessarily what we see in the volume research. So as someone that maybe values the outcome-oriented data a little bit more, I would say, okay, I agree just like theoretically, that seems to make sense. Like that's just intuitive that after you train an exercise really hard, at some point it stops being effective. But then if you value outcome-oriented research quite a bit, you might say, man, we have to really question that, right? We need to rethink that. But what you're saying is, man, measuring hypertrophy is tough. I know you're not like really big in the swelling game, but maybe something like swelling is contributing here. And I just have enough conviction using logic or mechanistic rationale
and experience
that I'm going to operate as if after I do my third or fourth set on an exercise that I'm probably not going to benefit from additional sets. Is that pretty fair?
And until there's direct evidence against the contrary, maybe that's a decent position. That's kind of how I've interpreted it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also would say it's not that I'm not outcome driven.
Mm-hmm.
It's I'm very critical of all the papers I read, like the Brigado paper that used A-mode ultrasound. Like I don't think you can measure muscle growth with A-mode ultrasound. Some of these papers use circumference. Some of these papers just don't see growth. And when you toss all that in there and you interpret it independent of the analysis, it's like, how compelling is any of this literature as a whole? And that's how I kind of always approach it. I think y'all's paper is great. Like I think it's going to lead to a lot of good discussion and a lot of good research. So I think it's a step in the right direction. But I still have to read every paper, and I have to find out what every paper said. I need that layer to make my decision, right? A good example is that rest period meta that came out. Right? Do y'all remember the rest period Singer et al.?
Yep.
So this is one of those examples of the meta-analysis is the top tier piece of evidence that we can use to make a conclusion. But they have 9 studies included in that meta-analysis. 2 of those are low load training. Well, I think it's pretty well demonstrated that you can use short rest with low load training. One of those studies, Villanueva or something like that, used rest periods manipulated during a strength mesocycle. And the group that had short rest actually saw some growth. The group that had long rest didn't. So that's 3 studies that independently would tell a very different story than the meta-analysis. So that leaves 6 papers. 2 of the papers used incremental rest periods where it decreased 15 seconds every week. It started at 30 seconds or ended at 30 seconds.
Yeah,
One or the
it
other.
was like 120 to start with, something like that.
And it was treated as an average of 80. Well, I think 80 would be sufficient all of the time, where in reality, they probably trained with 2 shorter rests for 4 weeks and plenty of rest for the other 4 weeks. So that meta-analysis draws a conclusion, but independently, there's an explanation for each study for why they saw what they saw. And I think you need both. But that particular meta, I don't think is necessarily helpful. I think there's just too much variability in the studies that were included. But in general, I think you need both. And with the outcomes on volume, I don't find them to be consistent. And you find a study that had high volume but saw no growth. I haven't read it in a while, but I think the Cody Hahn paper, not the sarcoplasmic sub-analysis, but the original analysis was pretty high volume. It didn't see growth. The Armithingham study, I think was no growth. Yeah. I apologize to the authors if they listen.
Yeah.
But I think it's a bit more of a toss-up, at least from my perspective. And then the studies that do, right, then you have to look closely. And sometimes it's just difficult for me to reconcile. Let me give you an example. And this is just how I like to break down the research.
Sure.
I'm pulling up so I don't mess it up here. The Radiali paper, 1 set, 3 set, 5 sets. What's interesting to me is that the extensors, the triceps, grew 0.02 for the 3 set group over 6 months, but 0.8 in the 5 sets. So you're telling me that going from 3 to 5 sets per session went from no growth to 0.8 in the triceps. Like, I think everyone would agree that you're getting most of the stimulus from probably the first 3 sets, maybe a little bit additional from the other 2. So I'm more interested, okay, what happened here? Why did 3 lead to nothing and 5 led to amazing growth? I mean, that's very, very impressive growth. And that one I had to digitize it because I don't think
you
they
had to
provided the
use
raw
web plot.
values.
Yeah.
But like, there's so many instances where like when you dive deep into the data, just study by study, it's like, okay, well, that to me is not compelling on its own. And to be fair, yeah, when you combine them together, I completely understand, Josh, your perspective and why you would hold it. And I think you could be right. But I can't get over these little things that bug me.
Yeah.
Right? That bugs me.
Let me just say something really quick. I know you're going to have some things to say here because, like, a few times throughout the podcast, you've mentioned just, like, some outlier outcomes or just, like, okay, obviously on average, going from 3 sets to 5 sets per exercise is not going to go from no growth to, like, super robust growth. I'll let Zach take that because I think we might view that through a slightly different lens. But I just want to be clear for the record, like, I have these similar thoughts as you. Probably where I'm a little bit different is like, again, I come back to like what the alternative is. I have my questions about swelling or edema and the time course. I have my questions about what is actually required to maintain muscle mass. I have my questions about natural limits and training sustainability. I have my own personal experience about some aches and pains that still kind of linger and pop up here every now and again because of periods where I just trained with way too high of volumes. So, like, I guess I just want to be clear for the record. I'm not like this isn't high volume versus low volume. And a funny thing, and you alluded to this a bit before, is that when we were on Steve Hall's podcast at the very end, Steve was like, all right, I'm twisting your arm. What are your recommended volumes? And Sam's were a little bit higher than mine. So I just want to be clear for the record. This isn't really a high versus low volume. I think this is fruitful in terms of like, how do we...
It's like epistemology.
Epistemology, exactly. So with that, I'll let you take it, Zach.
Yeah, Sam, the interesting thing that I find, so, obviously I come at this from a little bit more like a stats perspective is kind of the way that I tend to think about these things. And the interesting thing that I hear you say are basically the statistical assumptions that go into meta-analysis, just formalized a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So essentially, the few things you brought up is you have individual studies that have variant outcomes, some of which that seem, frankly, bizarre when you look at them in isolation. You have an overall body of studies that, probably lean in a little bit of a overall direction, but you also have some studies that seem to go away from that direction. And ultimately, the thing that's comforting to me and why I view these types of projects when they're sufficiently powered, as you said, sometimes when you have only a couple studies that meet the relevant criteria, it's not particularly helpful. But, in our 5-hour Snooze Fest podcast, we kind of talked about a few of these things. But when we do these kinds of projects, it's able to take into account all those exact same issues that you just mentioned. So the first thing that I think is so hard for people to understand, and I'm not saying you're saying this, Sam, but it's just for a listener's perspective, even if we know and we generate data of a bunch of fake studies, 100, 1,000, whatever the number is, and we know for a fact there is an effect that is present, you are going to get studies that show wildly different outcomes purely due to sampling variance. Particularly, you layer on slow sample research or small N studies like we often deal with, that problem is going to get 100 times worse. And this is why just the more that I've done this and the more experience that we've gotten, it really does come down to saying an individual study is nothing more than a drop in a bucket. And I know a lot of people say that, but I think if things were presented in slightly different ways, which, to be fair, Sam's studies always have a control group, which I think is very, very important, which is essentially what I'm talking about is, our research, often we have like a region that is compatible with measurement error. And almost never is the study is the difference between conditions neatly within that, neatly outside of that, or some paints a very clear picture because the effects are extremely consistent or extremely large. That pretty much never happens, which basically is telling you the effects are ambiguous. We can't interpret these in isolation. And that's where these types of projects that directly model that sampling variance that we would expect across an entire body of literature, even if they had all the same effect, basically is going to take all those individual studies that have very, very variant outcomes that are on the outside of that normal distribution of effects that we would expect. Those get pulled in back towards the population mean. And each one of those studies, just like you do when you go and read all of them individually, you have this cloud in your brain of, this is what I would expect, generally speaking, this one's weird. That's exactly what a model does in knowing all of these other data points exist and pulls everything back towards a story that actually is cohesive with the literature at large. And so that's where, in one sense, I completely agree with you. And in the other sense, that's where I think these types of tools are.
Yeah, that's why we're so bullish on these sorts of approaches to get the directionality and an estimate of the magnitude while keeping in mind it's just a 10-week study.
And to be fair, like, knowing the individual studies is absolutely crucial, because then you're not going to be able to pick out, there's sampling variance, which is basically unexplained variance that just kind of happens. It's just this ambiguous cloud. But then there's also things that Sam just mentioned, about 6 cases of those things. Hey, this study had this specific characteristic that I may expect a very systematic treatment across studies. And if you don't know the individual studies and you just go and pop all those into a meta-analysis, and you don't have that critical lens of understanding these potential factors that could differ across studies, then you're missing a lot of context.
It's not either or. It's not individual studies or meta-analysis.
100%.
It's maybe just a slightly different perspective.
It's a synergistic approach of both. And all I was saying is, like, I totally agree with all the things Sam just said. I just think that's where the integration of both these tools, like you said, of understanding all of the individual studies and their details and their limitations and strengths, is very much in concert with formal synthesis of these kind of things, because I think it does explicitly kind of account for all those things and these effects that we're looking at. It's not just treating all these super variant outcomes with really big outliers and just saying, hey, what do we see, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to say that, because I think it's a really, really important marriage to have both of those things, because vote counting and those kind of things have issues because you're not able to handle the weighting of the variability of a given study, right? So a study has a mean change of 5 centimeters, but the standard deviation is absolutely massive. That study really has no confidence in describing that mean change, whereas another study maybe has a very different mean change and it's extremely confident about that mean change. That's where meta-analysis and things like this can be helpful, but again, without understanding those exact characteristics of the study, that also can be extremely limited. And an easy example of that, and I'll shut up and get off this diatribe, is the meta-analyses that we've discussed in the past. We've basically taken a categorical variable that's generally been examined, and we've tried to move that in a direction because we understand the characteristics of the underlying studies. So it's really just trying to do meta-analysis better, I think, is the answer, in concert with understanding those characteristics allows you to do that in a formal way. So yeah, in no way are we getting off the train of going through all the individual papers and combing through all those details. But yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective that I have that hopefully kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think we're speaking past each other a little bit, because I think the uncertainty is kind of reflected in y'all's meta-analysis. And I honestly think me and Josh's disagreements just at the higher end, like the very upper end. So we're disagreeing on just the most specific details where, it could go either way, I think. I tend to think the quality of the data that we have of anything beyond 27 sets, I just don't think it's that amazing. And I think that's a big limiting factor where, we do our best and try to address it through the uncertainty. And that's when there's going to be different perspectives. What I like about what y'all do is you do speak with caution, and even with your own paper, I've heard other people interpret it kind of differently. And, I I think especially from the scientists, like it's our job to be kind of the most conservative, and I think you're allowed to say what you think. Like I actually did an episode with Steve a few weeks ago, and we talked about communicating science, and I think it's important to let the listener or viewer or reader, whatever you're posting your content, know when you cross the bridge to this. I think we've demonstrated with a good bit of certainty. This is what I think based on the data, but um, and then always acknowledge the differing view. And I think sometimes that is what's missing on the online space. Um, Sometimes by design. I mean, I'm blocked in comment sections, and I don't think I've ever been rude. You know, it's just I'll point to this or that, and I'll say, yeah, what about what about this? Is this a possibility? Um, but um, yeah, I don't think we're far off from each other, but I do think y'all's paper will be a catalyst for um, uh, some good studies, and I think one of them will be in my lab. I'm still working on our replication study, but I'm acquiring a new arsenal of equipment because I want to do full body training in a way that people train, or I want to try to do that.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I realize, and I'm guilty of this too. Like the Schoenfeld volume study that we're replicating, a lot of people complain, well, there's no glute work, there's not a lot of hamstring work. Um, certain exercises that they wish were in that program, and that's not a diss on their study design. I know why we design studies. We design studies based on the equipment that we have. Like you work with what you have in research. Um, but I want to do studies that are how people would want to train, maybe to the point where they want to sign up because this is exactly what they want to do. Um, and then try to answer some volume related questions that way. Um, I don't know if you guys want to switch gears a little bit, but um, Josh, I was listening to you, and this is just entertaining the swelling concept, right? I think it's worth entertaining.
Yeah.
Because you said you were squat and bench 3 times a week. You said that's just not realistic or sustainable, or it
Yeah.
was really tough. I forget your exact language.
I was alluding to that. That was from a clip, so some of the context might have been lost. But I was
Clipped yourself. That's
yeah,
hilarious.
exactly. Yeah, clip yourself, and yeah, exactly. That's my own fault. But
Well, actually, I was listening to the episode,
okay, perfect.
and then I saw the clip, so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
actually listened to the episode.
Hey, my man. So basically, I was alluding to a study that Zach was the lead author on. It's on Sport Archive, where we compared 4 to 6 RP versus 7 to 9 RP versus 7 to 9 plus the last set to failure. And originally in that study, we had a group taking every single set to failure 3 times a week on squat, bench press, and deadlift. Or sorry, just squat and bench press, no deadlift. And we did not continue on with the failure group because it was just not okay. We needed to stop that. So that's what I was alluding to. And I guess the larger point I was making there is that very high workloads, whether that's through volume or proximity to failure, I'm wary to recommend them broadly. And that's an example of a case where I would not recommend it because of that direct lab experience.
And like we would advocate for, generally speaking, for hypertrophy training pretty close to failure. It's just the way you recommend that is it's tough, right?
So just to clarify, but continue on, Dr. Buckner.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. Our experience in our replication study has been that the 5-set group, most people think it's too much. And sometimes I feel bad for them, when, it's in one training session, 5 sets of squats, 5 sets of leg press, and 5 sets of knee extension. And maybe it's just, the environment you get in the lab. It's intense. Like every rep is it's a lot. And, it makes me think that, maybe it's possible that some people are inflamed at post testing. Like I think that's it. Me and Holly have talked about it. When she does these crazy training blocks, like there'll be sessions where she feels swollen for a couple of days. And that's antidote, right? So that's weak, but it's at least put the seed in my mind that it's possible. And, I don't want to be so arrogant as to just know that it's not the case, right? Because I've seen other studies, and I maybe there's a good reason to think that it's not the case. Um, but maybe a part of the sample is experiencing this. Even if it's just a phenomena of this is your last training session, go big or go home, right?
Mhm.
That's a level of volume that I think is a lot, and especially when you consider the movements. So, um, I'm not here saying I think this is the culprit. Um, I originally put it out because I think it's just as reasonable explanation as that magnitude of growth as possible. Um, and I have an approved IRB to actually test it, but I can only do so many studies at once.
Hey,
So
we
we
hear
are going
you.
to test it, and I assume other labs. I think D'Souza's working on something too. I
Yeah.
saw him post something that they're working on, but you know, I think people need to not get defensive over questions and ideas and just get excited to test it, you know?
Yeah.
There's so much reaction online sometimes and drama. And another thing is, so I wasn't even aware that this strength and swelling thing and that this was on the table. And you know, I I've seen the scientific community kind of coming after the idea pretty hard. And I think they should extend some grace. Um, in that, I think as scientists, we should express what we believe, but then, I think to years, 6 years ago, the same people that are saying, well, strength and hypertrophy, there's not a perfect relationship, were very critical of some of our work that questioned, well, we had growth but not strength. Um, and we're saying, well, the strength potential is just not realized. There's all these things that were discussed, kind of dancing around the data because it didn't make sense to them. And I am hopeful that the scientific community is less abrasive and less sarcastic and less. Not you. I'm not talking about you guys. Um, when they talk about these things, and you know, because a lot of them were there 5 6 years ago, and it's interesting what I've seen. And again, I didn't even know this was up again in discussion, but I've
Yeah.
noticed different posts online, and you know, I it's something we wrote about years ago because when you train with low loads, you get hypertrophy, but you don't get meaningful strength.
Yeah.
And you know, at the time, it's like, oh well, that's a decrease in muscle quality. And
Here,
I'm sure y'all are familiar.
here's a quick question for you, Sam. Just it's honestly just a quick one, but when you say there's no strength, do you only mean that in the context of like a strength assessment, or would you say it also wasn't totally apparent that those individuals were like progressing their training loads across the interventions, like the load that they're lifting for their assigned protocol in the low load condition? I'm curious what you mean there.
Oh yeah, and let me correct that. There wasn't no strength adaptation. There just wasn't as good of a strength adaptation as the traditional high load training. And there was progressive overload, right? So they're getting stronger within their rep ranges and these sorts of things. But absolute 1RM strength typically underperformed. And that's what led us to kind of, begin writing on the relationship between changes in muscle size and changes in strength. Is we would dance around it in our discussions. Like when we would write a discussion, we would, put up all these weird ideas and we were kind of forcing it to fit the mold. Okay, why didn't we see this? We're making excuses. And then, finally we embrace the possibility that, okay, maybe this is just not an adaptation that you're gonna really see with this type of training. Um, Now you can get that adaptation with some low volume strength training, right? But this idea that strength has to change with muscle growth, I think is a pretty old one because of all the low load training research that was coming out in the, I don't know, 2010 to 2018. Um, and I think it's DeFreitas et al. That had the nice time course paper, and they tracked changes in muscle size along with changes in strength, and they looked at they called it muscle quality, the ratio of these things, and they said at this point we're pretty confident the growth was real because this is the first point where the ratio returned to what a little bit above what it was at baseline, the strength relative to the muscle size. And they were kind of debating back and forth with Philippe Damas, who I think was at McMaster at the time, and their echo intensity paper. So they were trying to argue when can we actually measure growth? When is it swelling and edema? And my actual take on that whole discussion was, it seems like there's a fair bit of confidence that we can measure growth pretty quickly. DeFreitas was conservative in suggesting that around 3 weeks, they were pretty confident that swelling's no longer playing a large role and that it's growth. Um, and DeFreitas, I think maybe they were less conservative and they said around 11 or 12 weeks. It's something like that. It's been a while since I've read this paper. Um, I'm skeptical on echo intensity as actual indicator of swelling, to be honest. But that discussion takes place in the context of the protocols that they were using, right? So again, I'm not arguing for swelling, but I am pointing out that that conversation took place in the context of the training protocols that they were implementing and the volumes that they were using. So it at least extend some grace till we have data, and then share your opinion and why you hold that opinion. But I just wanted to point out that a lot of people that are really railing hard, and I think it's because different camps develop, and it's okay to speak a certain way to these people because they're not in this group, and then this group, we're less harsh in our words against these people. I tend to respect all views and take them and absorb them and try to see if they make sense to me. And that one doesn't make sense to me necessarily. I get why they think that. And a large portion of the scientific community thought the same thing 5, 6, 7 years ago. So
So
I think
I,
that's
I think this is a perfect point to end on. I think the three of us are quite aligned that we're all open-minded and we would be stoked to add a correction factor of the effects of swelling to our main model.
Dependent on volume, yeah.
Yeah, dependent on volume, which that would probably be almost impossible, but just theoretically, we would love to learn more about swelling, and we're very open for that possibility, just like it sounds like you are. And I wish we would have had more time to talk about this. Not that I regret anything we talked about because it was all fantastic. There's just so many good things to touch on. But I thought you would be a really interesting person to talk about the narrative that has been going on. So just to kind of to clarify for folks a bit, just from a high level, the dose response relationship our model suggested for the effects of additional sets on additional strength gains, it plateaued somewhere in the 5 to 10 sets per week range. Whereas for hypertrophy, there was not a clear plateau. You could make an argument for like a functional plateau, maybe around 25 sets, maybe around 30 plus sets. And then, like you said, Sam, there's just not a ton of data up there, so you could even make the case for maybe even a little bit lower. But ultimately, the dose-response relationship is stronger for the effects of volume on hypertrophy. So what some people have landed on, and I don't want to just like present this in a way to dismiss it, to your point. And I'll also say that I'm not going to put all my cards on the table quite yet because I think Zach and I need to give that an individual segment in the future once we've really discussed it deeply, because I think it deserves that attention. But ultimately, the thinking goes something to the degree of, okay, if beyond, say, 5 sets per week, we're not consistently seeing increases in muscle strength, how is it possible for there to have been concurrent increases in hypertrophy or additional hypertrophy that occurs? And even though you're not, and therefore it must be swelling, or it must be something else causing the increase in muscle size. And the reason I think you're such an interesting person to get just like your stake in the ground, or at least your general thoughts here, is that you have extensive experience with Jeremy Lenicky, who is popular for noting that changes in muscle size are not necessarily indicative of changes in muscle strength in the research that we see in these short-term studies. So this just opens up a whole can of worms, and we're kind of returning to this old debate that has just been going on for decades and decades, and it's kind of repopularized recently as a result of that. So I guess I'm curious, because we don't have a ton of time here, just to get your general take on that line of reasoning. And again, I'm not saying swelling yes or no. I'm just saying, is that a reason to bring up the question of swelling, or is that fundamentally flawed? And before I kick it to you, Zach has something
one
quick.
quick clarification, just so I'm trying to steel man that as much as possible. They would not make the claim that they are perfectly correlated by any means. It's much along the lines of, if I know for a fact that hypertrophy occurred, there must be additional force production to show for it, is essentially the claim, I think. So
Yeah.
not that they're perfectly correlated by any means.
Yeah, I think I've given this a lot of thought, and I think I've come to a conclusion. And my conclusion, again, this is just what I think, and I share this with my class, and I try to get what they think on this too, get them to try to fight me on it. I don't think in 8 weeks muscle growth is ever doing anything meaningful for strength. It doesn't mean that muscle growth isn't meaningful for strength, but over 8 to 12 weeks, I don't think it's doing anything. And I challenge anybody, and it's I would love for them to show it. I keep trying to show it through study design, and I can't. Having muscle growth over 8 to 12 weeks never leads to more strength than not having muscle growth over 8 to 12 weeks. So it's a reality of the literature. I'm fairly confident um, and that muscle growth in the literature that we're all familiar with is never playing a meaningful role in strength. And again, that's not it doesn't say in the book, it doesn't conclude anything other than over this time period, you could have had the growth or not had the growth. I think your strength adaptation would have been exactly the same.
Here's a quick clarification question. Sorry, we only have a short amount of time, and I'm very curious about this.
Yeah.
Would you say the same for load progression within their rep ranges? So that would be like a strength assessment, which I think is mostly what the meta is showing. Would you say the same about load progression? Like progressive overload, evidence thereof.
If it's not a 1RM.
Correct. Like the training loads that they're utilizing or the reps they're performing with a given training load in their actual 8-week intervention.
It's hard to separate that one from specificity. But you could train other ways, get the same growth, and not have the same strength adaptation. So I don't know how you prove that one through study design. It's nearly impossible. That's just a function of how you train, and the functional adaptation you get along with how you trained, right? So that one's tough, but again, you could design 5 other arms that you could manipulate it to get growth and no strength, a lot of strength, no growth, the same strength with less growth. Like I think you could design it to show whatever you wanted to show. And again, the thing that remains to be demonstrated is that a group that has growth gets more strength than a group that doesn't over 8 to 12 weeks. And I think the reason that nobody seems to be able to produce that data is because you just can't. And that's why I think, again, I know I keep saying this, and it's so impossible to do. We need 6-month studies. We need 12-month studies. Like, and maybe we can find the point at which you can no longer get stronger unless you have growth. These studies are so difficult to do. It's a huge investment, and you need your design to be right in the front end because you don't want to waste your time. But I'm fairly confident that growth does nothing meaningful for strength over 8 to 12 weeks. And
So you would push back against that general line of thinking that I presented, that hypertrophy just theoretically could occur in the absence of additional incremental strength gain.
Hypertrophy could occur without incremental strength gain.
Additional hypertrophy could occur without additional strength gain in these 10-week studies.
This is one that makes your brain explode, right?
Because typically it's like the other way around almost. That's why I said I'm not putting all my cards on the table, because I want to give it the attention it deserves and not be flippant with it. Because
we're stealing Sam's notes.
Yeah, exactly. So we're stealing your notes for a future podcast episode.
And I know we're short on time, but we did Matt Jesse's dissertation was 90 reps per set at 10%, 15% on 1RM. We did not employ progressive overload. And we saw growth. I'd have to look back at if strength increased.
Yeah.
But we purposely did not employ progressive overload because it would interfere with our research question, because if you did, eventually the weight would get up to being 30%. and we wanted to see, can a weight that's so low that you're not really disturbing the blood flow, the mechanical compression's much less, can you still get growth? And if you can't, can you overcome that with blood flow restriction? Um, and again, I can't remember. I mean, we didn't see anything impressive for strength, and we didn't employ progression in any sense really. The only thing you could argue is that, um, no, that would be the opposite, because some of them were failing before they got to 90 reps at the beginning, but
Yeah.
by the end they could do all of the repetitions.
Yeah.
It's a good question, Josh, and it sounds like you got something cool you're working on or that you have. But again, in a certain scenario, it makes sense. In others, maybe it could be challenged a little bit,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair take. And yeah, just to very briefly respond to that, I think there are plenty of reasons why we would question, especially the upper end of the dose response relationship. We've mentioned a few throughout the show. That one, at least where I'm at right now, isn't all that convincing for multiple reasons. For example, just basic model uncertainty. Like, I think people underestimate how easy it could be for additional data or slight differences in statistical methods for it to instead be a very sharp plateau, instead be a very gradual and albeit small, but additional strength gain as sets go up. So like
also just completely different data sets too. That's
and then the
thing, right?
big hitter that people miss is that they are different data sets. They're a lot of the studies that informed the strength dose response did not also have hypertrophy data. So we're kind of like trying to draw these connections with indirect links, basically, which is kind of it can be hypothesis generating for sure, but really the best way to look at it would be to use studies that measure both hypertrophy and strength, which we hope to present here pretty soon in the future. But I'll let you. Actually, with that, let me just kick it over to you and give you a chance to provide any final thoughts, and then where people can reach out to you or follow you, keep up with what you're working on in the future.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add real quick. Our replication study, I think, is going to add an interesting piece. We got a little off track because we had 2 hurricanes that hit us, and we basically had to shut down operations. But I think it's going to enhance my skepticism and enhance my suggestion that we need to do more replication with larger sample sizes and control groups. And that was the catalyst for me thinking about swelling was just, can I replicate this growth? And I'll be excited when we can finally share that, and hopefully maybe in a next semester we can get together and do that. But I don't know if I have necessary closing thoughts. I thought this was a great discussion. I think what y'all do is awesome. I think you found a good balance, and I love your approach. I can't stand scientific content on social media, but y'all create stuff that I find very valuable. And this is the discussions you have and the way you approach and treat people, I think is awesome. So keep it up. To the people that listened, hopefully you learned something today. I know I was a little scattered. I get excited when I talk about this stuff. But I guess I would just say remain speculative, and listen to people that think differently. If you do that, I think you'll enhance your ability to think critically and find what you think is the truth, and be patient with us scientists, because we take a long time and this process is slow, and there's a lot of us out there, I think, that are trying to do good things and answer some interesting questions.
Slow.
So
yeah. And I'll just add, it's slow. It's also painful. So
look at my head. The hair's all gone.
Well, we really appreciate your time. We'll link Sam's Instagram in the description of this video or the podcast, no matter where you're listening. We really appreciate your time. We're probably a little scattered as well, but I think that's a feature, not a bug, because we get
a lot of good avenues.
A lot of good avenues, and a lot of stuff on the outline we didn't quite touch on. But again, I think that's a good thing, and it's exciting because there's so much more to learn. And the best part here is, I think, even though there are some maybe slight differences in terms of how we approach reasoning or how we approach coming to practical conclusions. I don't know if our practical conclusions are all that different in the way we look at that dose-response relationship. You alluded to it before is probably just a bunch of uncertainty once you get to the higher volumes, and we agree. So that's probably the best part here for folks is
it's that meme with the people shaking hands.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's just that's just how it ends.
Yeah, so we very much appreciate your openness to discussion and bringing up some questions, going back and forth, and not taking it personally by any means, and just, hey, let's hash it out and see what see what the listener thinks, and we'll probably shift our minds independently along the way, and that's what it's all about. So we appreciate your time, and we'll see everyone in the next episode. Peace.
Take care.
Appreciate y'all.